In today's video, let's take a look at my test and programming setup for my HO and N-scale locomotives. I started out with a 24-inch by 10-inch shelf that I got at my local home store. I started by trying to figure out if I could get 2 HO scale tracks and 2 N-scale tracks on the one shelf. The HO scale track is Atlas Code 100 and the N-scale track is Kato Unitrack. After considering this option for a while, I realized that there wouldn't be any place on the shelf to put my test equipment. My goal was to include the Digitrax PR4 for connecting to my computer to use JMRI for programming, as well as adding the Digitrax DB150 Command Station for testing the locomotives. I decided to go down to 1 HO scale and 1 N-scale track. For a previous project, I'd soldered the N-scale bumpers onto the Unitrack. In order to make the track fit, I'm going to need to make some adjustments. I got out my Weller soldering iron to attempt to desolder the bumper from the rest of the track. This was a little easier said than done and took me much longer than I'm showing in this video. I ended up pulling one of the rails out of the bumper and had to put it back together. There was some leftover solder in one of the joiners, so I was going to have to heat this up to make the connection. A little heat in the right place and it went right together. I decided to solder all of the track joints together, so I'm using some flux at all the connections. With the soldering iron set at 700 degrees Fahrenheit, everything is going together very quickly. I had previously used a piece of tape under the HO scale track to hold the pieces together. Now that I am soldering everything, I can remove the tape. The HO scale track that I'm using is some old track that I've had from the 80s. The bumpers have brass rails on them. For this reason, I'm making the rails on the bumpers as short as possible. I am using my Xuron track cutters to shorten down the bumpers. The rest of the HO scale track that I'm using is nickel silver. Once cut to the right length, I will also solder the bumpers onto the rest of the track. As you can see, the length of the HO scale track still extends just past the edges of the shelf. For this reason, I'm going to cut off part of the bumpers to make sure that the track just fits. I'm using the bumpers as I want to ensure that I'm not going to run the locomotives off the ends of the track. I am also taking a small piece off of the ends of the N-scale track. Now that I've decided to only use a single track in each scale, it gives me a lot more room to decide where I want to lay down each item. I decided to take apart my Digitrax DB150 to see if it was possible to reduce its size. After evaluating the situation, I decided to just leave it as is. Before I secured anything to the shelf, I wanted to just test out the track to make sure that it worked. For the N-scale track, I decided to put it 1 track width away from the edge of the shelf. I used some T-squares and marked out some lines to make sure that I would keep everything square. Once I had the N-scale track laid out, I decided to use the width of the HO scale track as the space between the two scales. While I had a wired feeder track for the N-scale Unitrack, I needed to solder feeder wires onto my HO scale track. I did this by soldering wires directly to the bottom of the joiners. One of the reasons that I'm doing this project now is that I wanted to try out a different method for securing the track before I started building out my N-scale layout. Weld bond was one of the recommended glues specifically for this purpose. While I liked working with this glue, I really should have sanded the smooth surface of the shelf before using it. I used a small putty knife to spread out the glue. I am lining up the track with the lines that I made previously, and then I am using 1, 2, 3 blocks to weigh it down. Rinse and repeat for the HO scale track. I am running the wires for the N-scale track underneath the HO scale track at the same location where I soldered the wires onto the HO scale track. This enables both track feeds to end up in the same location. Safety first. I'm using the fire extinguisher to weigh down my HO scale track because I do not have any more 1, 2, 3 blocks. The wiring block for the DB150 Command Station is a pretty standard part. For this reason, I decided to split it into 2 sections to make the wiring easier. The one connector will be the power in, and the other connector will be for the track wires. I did end up using some nails to secure the track, as with the smooth surface of the shelf, the glue did not stick as well as I would have liked. As I like to keep my wiring as neat as possible, I'm using zip tie mounts to keep the wires in place. I initially thought I was going to run the wires right behind the track, but this changes later. Am I the only one that really likes neat wiring? How neat is the wiring on your layout? Please leave your comments below. At this point, I was undecided as to how I was going to switch the track power from the PR4 to the DB150. The DB150 is an older Digitrax Command Station, and you cannot read DCC coders with this command station. Therefore, I will be using the PR4 for all of my programming. But I wanted to have the DB150 on my test and programming setup so that I can update the firmware on my various throttles or other Digitrax devices. Using the DB150 also allows me to test locomotives without having to hook up this shelf to my computer. I can also use my Digitrax throttles to program the locomotives directly. I did several tests throughout this process to make sure that everything was working as planned. Here I am using my Digitrax DT602D throttle to test that I can control my N-scale locomotive. While I was at it, I also tested the HO scale track. I really like using 3M dual lock reclosable fasteners to secure various pieces of electronics to my layout. Here I am installing it to the bottom of the DB150. I'm using some screws to hold down the Velcro to the board, as due to the smooth surface, I feel that it might come off in the future. I have been using these dual lock fasteners for a long time, and I really like them. I am also using this product to secure the PR4 to the shelf. The Digitrax PR4 is a computer interface that will allow me to connect my computer running JMRI to my test shelf. I am also screwing in this Velcro. Better safe than sorry. It's finally starting to look like something useful. Now that I have a better sense of where all the equipment is going, I'm cleaning up the wiring between the DB150, the Digitrax PR4, and all of the other devices. I will be using the same power source for the PR4 as I am for the Digitrax DB150. I'm going to be using a 15 volt, 3 amp power supply, which should be plenty for both devices. I will also be connecting a LocoNet cable between the DB150 and the PR4. The USB cable connected to the PR4 will be used to connect to my computer. I am using barrel connectors with screw terminals for all of my power. And of course, using cable ties to secure everything down. I'm going to put the female barrel connector right at the end of the shelf. The power supply will not be permanently mounted to the shelf, but will be managed separately. This will enable me to easily change the power supply should I ever need to. The only thing missing at this point is a way to switch the track power from the PR4 to the DB150. And that's where this double pull, double throw knife switch that I found online will come in handy. The center of the knife switch, the red terminals, will run to the tracks. The black terminals on the left will run to the PR4 track power, and the black terminals on the right will run to the DB50. This will allow me to easily switch track power from one device to the other without the risk of the track power between the two devices connecting to each other. The center off of the knife switch is a very important part of this. The center off of the knife switch also gives me the ability to cut power to the track completely if needed. I am using another favorite of mine, lever nuts, to connect the track power to the knife switch. I also screwed a plastic case down to the shelf between the PR4 and the knife switch to hold my DCC Concepts rolling roads. These are both N-scale and HO scale. So one last time, let's test to confirm that everything is working. First step is to plug in the power supply. I'm going to throw the knife switch towards the DB150, and then using my DT602D throttle, I'm going to check that I can control my Broadway Limited Imports GG1. And now I'm using my computer through JMRI to control my Great Northern 163 Broadway Limited Imports switcher. The N-scale switcher also works using the throttle. To my surprise, everything works as expected. What do you think of this project? Is this something that you might consider building yourself?
It's all about humanity. all about humanity.